Welcome back, legends. Before we start, subscribe and share this video right now. Comment below. Where are you watching from? And what time is it? Let's explore Scary World. In the fall of 2019, Thomas Brennan rented a cabin deep in the Cherokee National Forest for what he thought would be a quiet writing retreat. The property sat 3 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by a rutted dirt path that wound through stands of ancient hemlock and white pine. The cabin itself was a modest structure, 2 rooms, a wood stove, and windows that rattled when the wind picked up. The owner had mentioned the isolation when Thomas signed the rental agreement. What he hadn't mentioned was why the previous tenant had left 2 weeks early. Thomas arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late October. The leaves had already turned, painting the mountainside in shades of rust and gold. He spent the first evening settling in, arranging his laptop on the small kitchen table, stocking the pantry with supplies he'd brought from town. As darkness fell, he lit the oil lamps. The cabin had no electricity, and started a fire in the stove. The silence was absolute. No distant traffic, no aircraft overhead. Just the occasional pop of settling logs and the whisper of wind through the pines. It was around midnight when he first noticed the footsteps. They were faint at first, easy to dismiss as the natural sounds of an old building. But as Thomas lay in bed listening, he realized the pattern was too regular, too deliberate. Someone was walking around the cabin's exterior, moving in a slow circuit from the front door to the side window to the back wall and around again. The steps would pause occasionally, as if whoever was out there had stopped to look inside. Thomas got out of bed and moved to the window. He pressed his face close to the glass, cupping his hands around his eyes to block the lamplight behind him. The forest was a wall of darkness. He could see nothing beyond the first few feet of clearing. The footsteps had stopped. He waited there for nearly 20 minutes, watching, listening. Nothing moved. Finally, he convinced himself it had been an animal, a deer, maybe, or a black bear passing through. He went back to bed. The next morning, he found the tracks. They circled the cabin in a perfect loop, pressed into the soft earth where morning dew had dampened the ground. The prints were unmistakably human. Bare feet, adult-sized, with unusually long toes. What disturbed Thomas most was how close they came to the windows. In several places, the tracks approached to within inches of the glass, then retreated back into the circuit. Thomas spent that day trying to rationalize what he'd found. A local, maybe playing a prank on the city outsider. He considered packing up and leaving, but something stubborn in him refused to be driven away by footprints. He'd paid for 2 weeks. He'd stay 2 weeks. That night, he made sure every window was latched. He placed his hiking boots by the bed and kept his phone charged, though there was no signal this deep in the mountains. He left one lamp burning in the main room. The footsteps returned at 11:47 p.m. This time Thomas was ready. He moved silently to the window and looked out. For a moment he saw nothing. Then, at the edge of the lamplight's reach, he detected movement. A shape, roughly human in form, stood among the pines. It was too dark to make out details, but Thomas had the distinct impression that it was watching him. Not moving, not approaching, just standing there in the darkness, observing. He grabbed his flashlight and threw open the door, swinging the beam toward where he'd seen the figure. The light caught nothing but trees and shadow. He stepped out onto the porch, sweeping the flashlight across the clearing. The beam picked out tree trunks, fallen leaves, the glint of mica in exposed rock. No person, no animal. But as he turned to go back inside, the flashlight beam crossed something that made his breath catch. On the porch railing, less than 3 feet from where he stood, was a handprint, pressed into the layer of pollen and dust that had accumulated on the old wood. The print was larger than Thomas's own hand with those same unnaturally long fingers. It was still warm. Thomas backed into the cabin and locked the door. He pushed the kitchen table against it for good measure. The footsteps continued throughout the night, that same measured circuit around the cabin's perimeter. Occasionally he would hear something else, a sound like fingernails dragging across the wooden siding, or a soft exhalation just outside the window nearest his bed. When dawn finally came, Thomas didn't wait to pack properly. He threw his belongings into his car and drove down the mountain road without looking back. Later, when he called the owner to explain why he was leaving early, the man was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "You lasted longer than the last one." He made it 3 nights. Thomas never learned what the owner meant by that. He never asked about the barefoot visitor in the pines, never questioned why the rental listing had been removed from the website by the time he got home. Some things, he decided, weren't meant to be understood. They were simply meant to be escaped from. The cabin still stands in Cherokee National Forest. The rental agency has no current listing for the property, but locals sometimes report seeing lamplight in the windows on autumn nights, and hikers who pass too close to the overgrown access road occasionally speak of footsteps in the dark, measured, deliberate steps circling something they cannot see. Catherine Hayes inherited the cabin from her grandfather in the summer of 2017. The property had been in the family since the 1940s, nestled in a hollow of the Blue Ridge Mountains where the state line between Virginia and West Virginia blurred into irrelevance. Her grandfather had used it as a hunting camp for decades. After he passed, Catherine decided to spend a few weeks there, sorting through his belongings and deciding whether to sell or keep the place. The cabin was larger than she'd expected, 3 rooms, plus a root cellar dug into the hillside behind the structure. Her grandfather had been a meticulous man, and the cabin reflected that. Tools hung in neat rows in the shed. Firewood was stacked with geometric precision. Even the root cellar was organized, with shelves of dusty mason jars lining the stone walls. Catherine arrived on a Monday in late June. The weather was warm, and the forest buzzed with the sound of cicadas and birdsong. She spent the first few days cleaning, airing out the musty rooms, going through boxes of her grandfather's papers and photographs. It was pleasant work, nostalgic in a bittersweet way. She didn't venture into the root cellar until Thursday. The entrance was a heavy wooden door set at an angle into the hillside, the kind you had to lift and prop open with a stick. Wooden steps descended into darkness. Catherine propped the door open wide, letting afternoon sunlight spill down the stairs, and climbed down with a flashlight. The cellar was cool and damp, smelling of earth and old preserves. The jars on the shelves dated back years, decades in some cases. Pickled vegetables, fruit preserves, things Catherine couldn't identify in the dim light. At the back of the cellar, behind the last shelf, she found something unexpected, a second door. It was smaller than the entrance, barely 4 feet high, made of planks so old they'd gone gray with age. A heavy iron lock hung from the hasp, rusted but still functional. Catherine tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Locked from the outside, which meant whatever was behind it was meant to stay there. She made a mental note to ask her uncle about it later. He'd spent more time at the cabin than she had. Maybe her grandfather had used it for storage, or maybe it was just an old coal chute from before the cabin had been renovated. That night, Catherine woke to sounds from below. At first, she thought an animal had gotten into the cellar, a raccoon or possum, maybe knocking over jars as it foraged. But as she lay in bed listening, she realized the sounds were different. Not the random clatter of an animal, but something rhythmic, deliberate, like someone moving objects around, rearranging things in the darkness. She got up and went to the window. The root cellar door was still closed, just as she'd left it before bed. No sign of disturbance. The sound stopped as soon as she moved. Catherine stood at the window for several minutes, listening to the silence. Finally, she convinced herself she'd been dreaming and went back to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin, every settling board, made her wonder if the sounds had returned. In the morning, she worked up the courage to check the cellar. Everything was exactly as she'd left it. The jars on the shelves sat undisturbed. The small locked door at the back remained closed. Nothing seemed out of place. Catherine felt foolish for her nighttime paranoia. Old cabins made strange noises. That's all it had been. But that evening, as she prepared dinner, she heard it again. This time she was awake. This time there was no mistaking it for a dream. The sounds came from beneath the cabin, muffled by earth and wood but unmistakable. Something was moving down there. And more disturbing, something was knocking. 3 slow, heavy knocks against what sounded like the small door at the back of the cellar. Then silence. Then 3 more knocks. Catherine grabbed her flashlight and went outside. She yanked open the cellar door and descended the stairs, her heart hammering. The knocking stopped the moment she entered. She swept the flashlight beam across the shelves, the jars, the earthen floor. Nothing had changed. She approached the small door at the back. Up close, she could see that the wood was scratched long gouges in the old planks, as if something had clawed at it from the other side. The scratches looked fresh. Catherine reached for the lock, intending to open it and settle this mystery once and for all. Her fingers had just touched the rusted iron when a sound froze her in place. From behind the door, something breathed. It was a long, rattling inhalation, followed by a slow exhale that sounded wet and labored. Then another breath. And another. Whatever was back there was waiting just on the other side of the door, separated from her by a few inches of ancient wood. Catherine backed away. Her flashlight beam shook as her hands trembled. The breathing continued, steady and patient. She climbed the stairs without taking her eyes off the small door, emerging into the fading daylight with her pulse roaring in her ears. She called her uncle that night, asked him about the cellar, the locked door, what her grandfather might have kept back there. Her uncle was quiet for a long time. Finally he said, "Your grandfather told me never to open that door." Said his father had told him the same thing. Some doors, Katie, they're locked for a reason. They're meant to stay that way. Catherine left the next morning. She never went back into the cellar. Within a month, she'd sold the property to a developer who planned to tear down the cabin and build something modern. She didn't mention the root cellar or the locked door. She figured whoever bought the land could make their own discoveries. But before she left, she did one thing. She found the heaviest chain she could buy in town and wrapped it around the cellar door, securing it with a padlock. If something was down there, it could stay down there. The cabin was demolished in early 2018. The development never happened. The developer cited unexpected geological surveys and backed out of the project. The land sits vacant now, overgrown with kudzu and mountain laurel. But hunters who pass through the area sometimes report strange sounds emanating from the hillside where the cabin once stood, rhythmic knocking that echoes through the hollow, 3 slow beats that repeat endlessly in the darkness. In March of 2021, Robert Chen and his partner Elena Vasquez rented a cabin in the Nantahala National Forest as a weekend escape from Charlotte. Both worked demanding jobs in tech, and they'd been looking forward to a few days of hiking and disconnection. The cabin they'd found online was perfect, remote, affordable, with a view of the valley that looked stunning in the listing photos. They arrived late on a Friday evening. The last 3 miles of road had been rough, and by the time they pulled up to the cabin, twilight had already deepened into night. The structure was older than the photos had suggested, with a sagging porch and windows that didn't quite sit square in their frames. But it was clean enough, and the view even in darkness, to be spectacular. Robert hauled their bags inside while Elena started organizing the kitchen. They brought groceries for the weekend, planning to cook their meals rather than drive back to town. As Robert set up their sleeping bags in the loft, he noticed how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind of silence that felt oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. They ate a late dinner by lantern, light the cabins. Electricity was spotty and went to bed around midnight. The plan was to wake early and hit the trails at dawn. Robert woke instead to Elena shaking his shoulder. "Listen," she whispered. He lay still, straining to hear what had disturbed her. At first there was nothing. Then faintly he caught it voices. Multiple voices, coming from somewhere outside. They were distant, hard to make out, but definitely human. Conversation, maybe, or chanting. The sound rose and fell in a rhythm that seemed almost musical. Hikers, Robert said. Probably camped down in the valley. Elena didn't look convinced. It's 3 in the morning. Who hikes at 3 in the morning? She had a point. Robert got up and moved to the window. The cabin sat at the edge of a steep drop-off, with the valley floor hundreds of feet below. In the moonlight, he could make out the dark shape of the forest canopy, but nothing else. The voices continued, that strange rhythmic quality making them sound sometimes like singing, sometimes like ordinary speech. Maybe it's a radio, Robert offered. Someone's campsite radio, carrying on the wind. They went back to bed, but neither of them slept well. The voices continued until just before dawn, when they faded as gradually as they'd begun. In the morning, Robert and Elena decided to investigate. They took the trail that switched back down into the valley, figuring they'd find the source of the nighttime disturbance. Maybe a group of college kids on a camping trip, or a religious group doing some kind of ritual. Either way, they'd have an explanation. The valley floor was dense with rhododendron and mountain laurel, the trail barely maintained. They hiked for nearly 2 hours without encountering any sign of recent human activity. No campsites, no fire rings, no litter. Nothing to indicate anyone had been down here in weeks, maybe months. They headed back to the cabin as afternoon shadows began to lengthen. The hike had been pleasant enough, but the mystery of the voices nagged at them both. That evening they made dinner and tried to relax, but there was a tension neither wanted to acknowledge. A sense that they were waiting for something. The voices started again at 2:47 a.m. This time they were louder, clearer, and they weren't coming from the valley. They were coming from directly beneath the cabin. Robert and Elena sat up in their sleeping bags, staring at each other in the darkness. The voices rose through the floorboards, multiple speakers talking over one another in a language neither of them recognized. Not Spanish, not any indigenous language Robert had heard. The words had a guttural quality, harsh consonants and long vowels that seemed to echo unnaturally in the confined space. "There's nothing under the cabin," Elena said. "We checked. It sits on posts." Robert grabbed his flashlight and climbed down from the loft. Elena followed. They moved to the front door and stepped out onto the porch. Robert aimed the flashlight beam beneath the cabin, illuminating the crawlspace between the floorboards and the ground. Nothing. Just bare earth and the wooden posts that supported the structure. But the voices were unmistakable now, coming from below, from the ground itself. And as Robert and Elena stood on the porch listening, they realized something that made their skin crawl. The voices were calling out to them. Not by name, they couldn't make out actual words, but with an intonation that was clearly meant as summons. "Come down. Come to us. Join us." They packed their bags in 15 minutes and loaded the car by flashlight. Neither of them spoke as they navigated the rough road back to the highway, and it wasn't until they were 50 miles away, sitting in an all-night diner with the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, that they finally talked about what they'd heard. Elena pulled out her phone and did a search for the property address. What she found made both of them go quiet. The valley below the cabin had a history. In the 1890s, it had been the site of a mining operation, mica mining, dangerous and poorly regulated. A collapse in 1894 had killed 17 workers, trapping them in the tunnels that honeycombed the hillside. The bodies were never recovered. The mining company had simply sealed the entrances and abandoned the site. And according to local legend, the voices of those trapped miners could still be heard on certain nights, calling out from beneath the earth, trying to find their way back to the surface. Robert and Elena never returned to collect their deposit. The cabin's owner eventually stopped answering their emails. When Elena tried to find the listing again months later, it had been removed from every rental site. The property itself seems to exist in a kind of bureaucratic limbo. No current owner on record, no tax assessment, no legal address. But hikers who venture into that particular stretch of Nantahala Forest sometimes report strange acoustic phenomena, voices echoing from the valley floor, or from beneath their feet, or from everywhere at once. Conversation in a language no one speaks anymore, rising and falling in rhythms that sound almost like singing, almost like summoning. And those who linger too long say the voices begin to sound familiar, as if somewhere in that ghostly chorus you can hear people you once knew, calling you to come down and join them in the darkness below.